The Flip Side. Chapter 1. The Unsettling Presence. Savannah Evans had always considered herself a rational person. A quiet life in a small town suited her well, and she enjoyed the predictability of her daily routine. But lately, something felt wrong. Items in her apartment were misplaced, doors left open when she was sure she had closed them, and eerie shadows flickered in her peripheral vision. The unsettling feeling began subtly. A book slightly askew on the shelf here, a half-closed cabinet door there. But over the course of several days, the inexplicable disturbances grew bolder. It was as if her safe haven had slowly been infiltrated by an unseen force determined to upend her orderly existence. The first real scare came when she found muddy footprints leading from her front door to her bedroom. She lived alone. The sight of those dark, irregular tracks sent a surge of panic coursing through her veins. Savannah's heart pounded as she followed the trail with trembling hands, searching every nook and cranny of her apartment. Yet, despite the unnerving evidence, every lock was still secure and every window fastened. Even her closest friends, when she confided in them, could only offer the rational explanation that she must be overworked or stressed, that perhaps she had created the chaos herself and then forgotten. But deep down, a cold certainty gnawed at her. Something was terribly wrong. In the following days, the fabric of her daily life began to fray. Savannah found herself staring at familiar corners of her apartment as though for the first time. The once comforting creaks and sighs of the old building now sounded like whispers plodding in the dark. Every misplaced object, every door left ajar, took on the appearance of a deliberate message. Determined to understand what was happening, she began to document the incidents in a battered journal. Each entry was a mix of precise observations and raw emotion, an attempt to cling to logic while the irrational fear threatened to overwhelm her. At night, the atmosphere in her apartment grew oppressive. The weak glow of streetlights filtered through drawn curtains, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to slither across the walls. Savannah would lie awake, listening intently to the silence, straining to catch any sound that might betray an unseen presence. Sometimes, in the stillness, she heard what might have been a faint rustling, a soft, almost imperceptible sound that disappeared as quickly as it came. It was enough to make her question whether the disturbances were merely figments of her imagination or something far more sinister. Her once methodical routine now revolved around constant vigilance. Before leaving for work, she would double and triple-check the locks on her doors and windows. Every return home was accompanied by a cautious scan of each room, as if expecting to find evidence of an intruder hiding in the shadows. Yet despite all these precautions, the eerie signs persisted. One morning, she awoke to find the arrangement of her belongings subtly altered. A framed photograph had been tilted, her favorite mug was no longer on its usual spot on the counter, and a thin layer of dust had gathered on surfaces that she had cleaned just the day before. Each small anomaly chipped away at her sense of security. During the day, Savannah attempted to immerse herself in work and the comfort of routine, but her mind kept wandering back to the inexplicable events at home. In quiet moments, she wondered if the rational world she had always trusted was beginning to betray her. The more she thought about it, the more she recalled local legends and old town whispers about mysterious happenings in overlooked corners of their community. It wasn't that she believed in ghosts or malevolent spirits, but the mounting evidence in her own home was hard to dismiss. A creeping thought began to take root. Perhaps the boundary between the rational and the unknown was not as impermeable as she had once believed. Desperation spurred her to take measures she had never before considered. One rainy evening, with the wind howling outside and the power flickering ominously, Savannah decided to install a series of small cameras around her apartment. That night, as she huddled in the dim light of her living room, She replayed the footage over and over, searching for a sign of movement, a glimpse of a shadow where none should be. The recordings, however, revealed nothing more than the static of an empty room. The impasse only deepened her unease. If there was someone or something present, it seemed determined to remain unseen. Every night, the darkness brought with it an escalating terror. Savannah would sit by her window, peering out into the ink-black street, her eyes straining to detect any sign of intrusion. The interplay of shadows outside and inside her home blurred the line between reality and nightmare. In those moments, her rational mind battled with the irrational fear that had taken hold. She clung to logic, telling herself that the muddy footprints and the subtle rearrangements of her belongings could be explained away as coincidences, mere lapses in memory, or the result of fatigue. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, the disquiet became impossible to ignore. Friends tried to reassure her, suggesting that perhaps she was simply under the influence of too many late nights and too little sleep. But every reassurance felt hollow in the face of the relentless, inexplicable disturbances. Even the most mundane objects in her apartment seemed to hold secrets, whispers of a presence that lurked just beyond the reach of reason. The palpable tension in the air was a constant reminder that her life was no longer governed solely by the laws of logic and order. As Savannah sat at her kitchen table one chilly evening, journal in hand, she began to write down her theories about what might be happening. Could there be a rational explanation, a clever prank, perhaps, or even a case of mistaken identity? Or was it possible that something otherworldly had found its way into her meticulously ordered existence? With each written word, the line between fear and curiosity blurred. She resolved that she would not allow herself to be paralyzed by terror. Instead, she would confront the unsettling presence head-on, piecing together every clue, every anomaly, until she could either banish the specter from her life or at least understand its origin. In that quiet moment of determination, Savannah realized that her life was at a crossroads. The safety and predictability she had always cherished were slipping away, replaced by a reality that was as baffling as it was frightening. The disturbances were not random, they were deliberate, methodical, and deeply personal. And as she set her pen down and looked around her dimly lit apartment, she could no longer ignore the feeling that she was being watched by something far more complex and mysterious than she had ever dared to imagine. Thus, the first chapter of a darker, unforeseen journey had begun, a journey that would force Savannah to confront the fragile boundaries of her own reality and to question the very nature of the unseen forces that had invaded her once peaceful world. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Dark. The nights became unbearable. Savannah woke up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, with no memory of her nightmares but a lingering sense of dread. It wasn't the kind of fear that subsided with a deep breath or a sip of water. It clung to her, burrowing into her chest like icy tendrils, making it impossible to sleep again. She tried everything: lavender oil, white noise, even sleeping with the lamp on, but nothing helped. Each night, she closed her eyes, only to wake up with the same suffocating panic and the unsettling feeling that something had been there, lurking just out of reach. After a week of restless nights, Savannah decided she needed answers. She set up her phone to record while she slept, placing it on her nightstand with the camera facing her bed. If something was happening, she needed to see it with her own eyes. The first few nights showed nothing unusual, just hours of her tossing and turning, her body restless even in sleep. But on the fourth night, everything changed. She woke up as usual, gasping and covered in sweat. But this time, when she checked the footage, her stomach knotted with dread. At exactly 2:47 a.m., she saw herself rise from bed in complete silence. There was something unnatural about the way she moved, slow and deliberate, as if being controlled by an unseen force. Her body drifted to the kitchen, her bare feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. Once there, she stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes, staring at nothing. Then, she whispered something under her breath. Her lips moved, but the words were too soft to be understood. The footage ended with her walking out of frame, yet she had woken up safely in bed that morning. The logical part of her brain tried to reason it away, sleepwalking, stress, exhaustion, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Terrified, she scheduled an appointment with the doctor. She sat stiffly in his office as he asked questions about her stress levels, medical history, and family background. He mentioned parasomnia, a condition that could cause people to walk and talk in their sleep without memory of it. He recommended lifestyle changes, relaxation techniques, and a prescription for mild sleep aids. But when her medical results came back completely normal, her unease only deepened. There was no logical explanation for what was happening to her. That night, she resolved to stay awake, determined to catch herself in the act. She brewed strong coffee, kept her laptop open with a movie playing, and left every light in her apartment on. For hours, she sat curled in bed, her eyes stinging with exhaustion but her willpower strong. The clock ticked on. 1:00 a.m. 2:00 a.m. Her eyes fluttered shut. She snapped them open. Her head jerked, her body heavy with sleep. The movie was still playing, the light from the screen flickering against the walls. She forced herself upright, shaking off the drowsiness. Just a little longer. She could make it. 2:30 a.m. A noise. Her breath hitched. It was faint but distinct, the creak of a floorboard in the hallway. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Slowly, she reached for her phone and activated the camera, her fingers trembling as she angled it toward the door. The hallway light flickered, just for a second, before steadying again. Her phone vibrated in her grip. She nearly screamed. When she glanced at the screen, a notification blinked up at her. Motion detected at 2:47 a.m. Dread twisted inside her like a vice. With a shaking hand, she opened the security app connected to her living room camera. The live feed loaded, grainy and slow. At first, she saw nothing. Just her empty apartment, silent and undisturbed. Then movement. A shadowy figure stood in the kitchen, motionless. Her heart seized. She knew it was her body, standing there as it had the nights before. But this time, there was something else. A flicker in the background, just beyond the reach of the camera's night vision. It was barely visible, a shape darker than the shadows around it. And then, her recorded self moved. Her body turned, looking directly into the camera, though her eyes were closed. The movement was too slow, too deliberate. Her lips parted, and this time, the audio picked up a whisper. Savannah turned the volume up, pulse hammering in her throat. The whispering grew clearer. Not alone. A chill ripped through her spine. Her reflection on the screen smiled. She screamed, throwing her phone away as if it burned her. The device clattered to the floor, the screen blinking off. She scrambled back against the headboard, clutching the blanket to her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't sleepwalking. Something was in her apartment. Something was inside her. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, she sat in bed, knees hugged to her chest, staring at the darkened hallway. Every creak of the building made her flinch. Every shadow sent her heart into her throat. When morning finally came, she forced herself to check the footage again. This time, the recording was different. It showed her rising from bed, just as before, moving to the kitchen, just as before, whispering just as before. But this time, she didn't return to bed. The footage ended abruptly, with her still standing there in the kitchen, eyes closed, lips moving. She had no memory of returning to bed, no recollection of waking up. And yet here she was. Terror settled deep in her bones. Whatever was happening to her, it was getting worse. Chapter 3. The Fractured Mind. One evening, Savannah discovered deep scratches on her arms, as if made by fingernails. Her hands trembled as she examined them. Had she done this to herself in her sleep? The realization made her stomach churn. If she couldn't trust her own body, who could she trust? She took a deep breath, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe she had an episode of sleepwalking. Maybe she had brushed against something sharp. But as she searched for logical explanations, a nagging fear crept in, one that she had tried to suppress for weeks. Desperate for answers, she expanded her recordings to cover every corner of her apartment. She bought additional cameras and set them up meticulously, making sure there were no blind spots. Before bed, she tested them all, ensuring they captured every angle. If something or someone was manipulating her body in the dead of night, she would see it. That night, she forced herself to stay awake, watching the footage from the previous night. Hours passed in eerie silence as she fast-forwarded through uneventful clips. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., something changed. Savannah saw herself move again, but this time, her movements were erratic. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, her lips forming words she didn't understand. A low murmur accompanied the video, barely audible. She increased the volume, and her heart clenched as she heard her own voice whispering in a language she did not know. Then she turned to the camera and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculated. "Do you see now?" her recorded self whispered. Savannah dropped the phone in horror. This wasn't something external haunting her. This was her, but not the version of her she knew. Shaking, she clutched her arms. The scratches stung, a cruel reminder that whatever was happening was real. Her mind raced. If she was doing these things in her sleep, then who or what was in control? The rest of the footage was just as disturbing. The recorded Savannah stood still for minutes at a time, staring at the camera with unblinking eyes, her breathing barely perceptible. Then, suddenly, she would convulse, her limbs jerking unnaturally before going still again. The next morning, she avoided looking at herself in the mirror. The image from the footage was burned into her mind. The eerie smile, the distant gaze, the whispered words. She needed help. She called her best friend, Elise. "Elise, I need you to come over," Savannah said, her voice unsteady. "What's wrong? You sound off." "I don't know how to explain it over the phone. Just please. I need you here." Within an hour, Elise arrived, concern written all over her face. Savannah wasted no time. She replayed the footage, her eyes fixed on her friend's reaction. Elise watched in silence, her face draining of color. When the recording ended, she turned to Savannah. "That's safe. That's not normal," Elise whispered. "Are you sure you've never had sleep disorders before?" "I would remember something like this," Savannah replied. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." Elise rubbed her arms, clearly unsettled. "Maybe you should see someone. A sleep specialist or—" "No," Savannah shook her head. "This isn't just sleepwalking. Something else is happening." Elise hesitated before asking, "Do you remember what you said?" "In the recording?" "No. I have no idea what language that even was." Elise pulled out her phone and replayed the audio, then opened a translation app. She let the software listen, but it returned with no results. "Not recognized," Elise read aloud. "That's weird." Savannah felt a wave of nausea. Maybe it's just gibberish. Elise met her gaze. Or maybe it's not. Over the next few nights, Savannah tried everything. Sleeping with the lights on, staying awake, even tying her wrists together with scarves to prevent movement. Nothing worked. Each morning, she woke up exhausted, and the footage only grew worse. Her nighttime self became more aggressive, more unpredictable. She started leaving notes around the apartment, written in the same unknown language. One morning, she found a message scrawled in red ink on her bathroom mirror. "Let me in." She hadn't written it, at least not consciously. By the fourth night, Savannah was at her breaking point. She set up her laptop to record a live feed while she slept, positioning it on her nightstand so she could see herself in real time. She drifted off despite her fear, exhaustion overpowering her. Hours passed in silence. Then, at 2:47 a.m., her body stirred. Her eyes snapped open, but they weren't her eyes anymore. The pupils were dilated, swallowing the irises in inky blackness. A slow, eerie smile spread across her lips. She turned her head toward the laptop camera, and she spoke. "I see you." Savannah woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. She lunged for her laptop, fumbling to stop the recording. With shaking hands, she played it back. Everything had happened exactly as she remembered. She had looked straight into the camera and acknowledged herself watching. Tears streamed down her face as she slammed the laptop shut. She couldn't deny it anymore. Something was taking over, and it was getting stronger. A knock at her door startled her. Heart pounding, she grabbed a kitchen knife and hesitantly approached. "Savannah?" Elise's voice called out. Relief flooded her as she unlocked the door. Elise stepped inside, taking one look at Savannah's pale face and trembling hands before pulling her into a tight hug. "I can't do this anymore," Savannah whispered. "We'll figure it out," Elise assured her. "You're not alone in this." But deep down, Savannah feared that she was. Because the thing inside her didn't feel alone anymore. It felt at home. Chapter 4. The Other Side. Determined to confront the truth, Savannah locked herself in her bedroom with multiple cameras and mirrors surrounding her. If she was going to face whatever was happening, she needed to see it firsthand. The strange occurrences had gone on for too long. Whispers in the dark, objects moving without explanation, gaps in her memory that left her questioning her own sanity. Tonight, she would get answers. The air in her room felt heavier than usual, thick with something unseen. She glanced at the cameras, ensuring they were all recording. She had even placed a small handheld mirror in her lap, unable to shake the idea that she needed to be watching from all angles. As the clock struck 2:47 a.m., a wave of drowsiness threatened to pull her under. It was stronger than usual, an unnatural weight pressing down on her shoulders, urging her to close her eyes. She clenched her fists, gripping the armrests of her chair as she fought to stay awake. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then suddenly her vision blurred. It felt like a blink, just a moment where time stuttered, but when she refocused, everything had changed. She wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing in the middle of the room. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the largest mirror in front of her. At first, she saw only herself, disheveled hair, wide, terrified eyes, but then the reflection moved. Not in the way a normal reflection should. The other Savannah smirked and tilted her head. "You've finally stayed awake," she said. Savannah's lips had not moved. The voice came from the reflection. A cold dread crawled up her spine. She took a step back, but the reflection did not. It remained where it was, watching her with dark amusement. Her stomach twisted. "This isn't real," Savannah whispered. "I'm the demon." The other her laughed softly. "That's what you always told yourself, isn't it? But I'm real. I've always been here." Memories crashed into Savannah's mind, sharp and relentless. Every misplaced object, every whisper she had dismissed, every fleeting shadow in the corner of her eye, it had been her. Or rather, this version of her. A part of her that had been locked away long ago. A part of her that was now free. Savannah turned to the cameras, hoping for some grounding reality, but they were off. The red recording lights had gone dark. No matter how many times she pressed the buttons, they refused to turn back on. This is impossible, she muttered. Oh, but it is happening. The reflection took a step forward, out of the mirror. Savannah gasped and stumbled backward, hitting the edge of her desk. Her skin prickled with cold as the room itself seemed to distort. The walls pulsed as if breathing, the shadows deepening into something more than darkness. The other Savannah stretched, rolling her shoulders as if waking up from a long slumber. You've kept me trapped for so long, she mused, examining her hands. But now, you're too weak to stop me. Savannah's mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. Her limbs felt weighed down, as if bound by invisible chains. You see, the other Savannah continued, stepping closer, I was always here. The missing time? The strange occurrences? That was me, slipping through the cracks. Tears burned at Savannah's eyes. Why, she choked out. Because you needed me, the reflection turned reality said, her grin stretching unnaturally. You created me. When you were too weak to face things, I took over. When you wanted to forget, I held the memories. Savannah shook her head violently. No, you're lying. The other her sighed dramatically. Still in denial. That's fine. But it won't change what happens next. Dark tendrils of shadow curled around the room, inching towards Savannah like living things. She struggled, but her strength was draining fast. The other Savannah stepped forward until they were inches apart. Her cold fingers brushed against Savannah's cheek. You fought for control for so long, she whispered, her voice a haunting lullaby. But you're tired now, aren't you? A dizzying exhaustion crashed over Savannah. The room spun. Her eyelids fluttered, and she struggled to stay conscious. No, she whispered weakly. Yes, the other her cooed. Sleep. The last thing Savannah saw before the darkness claimed her was her own face, smiling, victorious, as she lost control to the other side of herself. And then silence,